is on the thinking era of what I call cause and effect thinking and parenting. And I think in a lot of ways, as I've thought about this idea in this broadcast and in preparation for it, I think really the problem is in the simplicity of cause and effect. Because I do think about, talk about, work on both of myself professionally, personally. I think about the impact we have on our children. But I think what happens in the issue of a lack of differentiation, of codependency, that when we reduce parenting and child interaction into simple cause and effect behaviors, we do something very harmful to the relationship, to the child, and to ourselves in the process. So tonight really is about steering away from that end of the continuum where everything is perfectly measured by cause and effect. And at the same time, I think that this idea, this concept, I think is important because it's one of the things that I think distinguishes the kind of thinking or sensibility that I teach in parenting work. This idea that I can be accountable for what I do, I can recognize it, I can be constantly improving of it, I can be sensitive and aware of the impact that I have on others around me, and at the same time, I can hold those ideas, and at the same time, I can release myself from the idea of simple and perfect cause and effect thinking. So with that preamble, let's get right into it. What is cause and effect thinking as it relates to parenting? It's the belief that good or healthy parenting guarantees healthy children and healthy choices by children, right? It's this idea that if I do it right, if I do it very well, then I am guaranteed to have the outcome that I want in my children. Just the very thinking reduces children to that of an object, right? Because objects don't have choices. Objects don't have agency. Objects can't react on their own to own that. You know, they're just the outcome that get acted upon. So the idea again here is that if we reduce it to that, you know, the idea in my book, if you know, the outcome of healthy parenting are not, it's not well-behaved children. The outcome of healthy parenting is clarity in the parenting, right? Awareness in the parenting, confidence, serenity. It's all of those things in parenting. I used to talk about this idea, in fact, that one early version of thinking about writing my book, I thought about calling it the coincidence of raising good kids. And this idea to kind of expand the idea that it's not a simple cause and effect is to say, you know, we have to give the children a lot of credit in this process too, right? Children can grow up and become healthy people in spite of our deficits. And I think about that with my own children at times. In spite of my limitations, my weaknesses, my mistakes, you can become a healthy, happy person living a rich life. And again, that releases them to their own sense of self. Even the thinking, this objective thinking, this objectification thinking, it leads to certain kind of behaviors in parenting that are harmful to the entire process. I used this analogy for years and years and years. In fact, I asked it recently at a parenting meeting outside of New York and New Jersey. I'm sure the people in New Jersey love to be considered outside of New York, but I was staying in New York, that's why I said that. But I was in New Jersey recently and I asked this question to the group, and I got the very similar answer that I've gotten over the years. I said, who's in charge of you getting a raise at work? You or your boss? And I said, how many people think that you're in charge? It's your responsibility to get a raise at work. And everybody in the room except for one person raised their hand at this point. Some people may not have voted, but everybody. And then I asked, how many of you think that it's your job's, your boss's responsibility for you to get a raise at work? And one person raised their hand. And of course, they told me right away they had already heard this analogy by me in a previous webinar. But the idea is this, and it makes so much sense. We know it to be true. We all can imagine, might even have an experience with this idea that you can be a fantastic employee and not get a raise. We know that's possible. Like I said, we might have even seen it. We also know that not very good employees can also get raises. Yes, it is a boss's job to recognize the workers that are doing a good job and in his or her employment. But ultimately, it's the boss's responsibility for raises, right? That's what makes them the boss. But we become, I think, so used to the idea that we control everything, right? We become so used to the idea that we have ultimate control. And then we have these children who come along to remind us that we don't, to remind us that we're not in charge of the universe, in charge of them. I would have students for years in my program, some of the more difficult ones, and I would say to some of them, thank you for reminding me that I'm not in control. It's a real gift, because sometimes I fall into this idea that I am in control because I'm incredibly manipulative at getting what I want from people as a therapist, as a father. But you're here to remind me that I'm not. There's an idea in systems theory about punctuation. Punctuation is this idea that we arbitrarily talk about a start and stop of a cycle, right? A cycle goes in circles, right? Each mutually reinforcing the other, feedback loops over and over. Punctuation says there's a start and stop. I did this, then you did this. That's arbitrary. And we punctuate to make sense out of things, to break cycles and systems down into smaller, more understandable parts. But they're not real. I'll talk about parenting through generations as we go along. Equal potentiality is the idea in systems theory, which was later adapted into family systems theory, that you can see the same outcome from very different beginnings. Inequal finality is that you can have similar beginnings with very different outcomes, right? We can all imagine a child who becomes a social worker, perhaps, to help abused children. And one might come to the job because they had a great childhood and saw others suffering. And one might have come to the job because they had a very abusive childhood and they wanted to offer the same kind of healing that they know that they needed in their life. So we can even think of examples in our own life, right? In our own families where similar kinds of origins led to different outcomes, and very different kinds of origin led to similar beginnings. Family systems theory does not place a great deal of energy into discovering the etiology of problems. Right? It just talks about what is, not what caused it. Family systems theory focuses on what is reinforcing and maintaining the dance, de-emphasizing blame. Family systems theory is forward thinking. It takes a lot of the shame, the guilt, and that charge out of the equation, out of the assessment, out of the treatment, so that people don't become paralyzed by it. Because even when people believe that they're well intended, if they come at families, individuals and families, your children, with that judgment, with that need to find somebody to point the finger at, it tends to shut people down. So this is a way of kind of opening us up a little bit. Where does it come from? First of all, it comes very, very early. Very early in birth, in our lives, we are much more responsible for our children, for their serenity, well-being, safety. Of course, as they grow older, we become less and less responsible for that, right? More and more agency. Teenagers are wired to start to want to push away, to make their own choices, to rebel against the status quo, what's expected of them. So it comes because early on, there's kind of this evolutionary requirement, more than any other species on Earth, that we take care of and that we're responsible for our child's life, right? But later on, we become less and less responsible. And adjusting throughout the lifespan to that can be difficult for a lot of us. We can have a hard time transitioning, especially when our children struggle, as your children do, right? We find it more difficult. It's more frightening to let go. Healthy attachment requires a clear and distinct sense of self. on the functional mother's part. This is the language they use in attachment theory. On the functional mother's part, in order to see and distinguish the child and her needs, right? The greatest work that you can do, the greatest contribution that you can make to your child is the development of your healthy self. It becomes the foundation, the right starting point for all the other decisions. But because we're anxious, because we're worried, because our children give us good reasons to be anxious and worried sometimes, and we focus on fixing that which is outside of us first, we become preoccupied with that project. And we don't do that foundational work. Even when I was thinking about this the other day, when I wrote my book and I hired an editor, I needed to whittle it way down from basically 500 pages to the size that it is now, around 235 pages. And I hired a professional editor that my publisher recommended. And she came back to me and she said, you got to get to the point. You know, parents want advice about how to raise children, and you meander in the beginning with this idea about going to your own intensive and finding yourself in the process. I ended up firing that editor because the things that they wanted to take out of the book were fundamental to the difference in what I was trying to say. Then eventually, after I got it edited, I had to do it myself, essentially, with some help with a colleague, but I had to do most of it myself. The final copy editor, the head person in the publishing team said to me that they wanted to take out the first chapter because, again, they wanted me to get to the point. But what I was trying to say, what I'm saying is something different. Not that anyone has ever said, but something different than mainstream society says about parenting, which is the solution to the parenting dilemma is in me as a father. Yes, my child has absolutely measurable, observable issues and problems. No doubt about that. But my dilemma, my struggle with it is about me. And I need to grow and expand and work on myself. So when I talk to you about going to these Finding You intensives, when I talk to you about doing this work, doing your work, I really am, after more than 20 years of this practice, telling you the best thing that I know that can make a difference in your life. And the parents, the parents who get into it, the parents who give it a try, say to me over and over and again, it's making all the difference in their life. Doesn't make all the problems go away, but it makes all the difference in their life. Our family of origin, the families that we grew up in, programmed us to see feelings as overlapping, and each family member disowned her feelings in order not to feel responsible for them. In this case, change was the responsibility of the other. My anxiety is your responsibility. My happiness is your responsibility. This is a fundamental message that most of us got. The interesting aspect of this was, do you know how sometimes in psychology there's kind of these cliches? You know, you're going to marry your mother, or you're going to marry your father. When they're talking about this, they're not literally talking about you're going to marry somebody who looks like your parent, who has the same job, the same hair color, the same build, the same habits. They're not talking about that. What they're really saying, what they really mean, is you're going to marry somebody who occupies the same kind of emotional space in a relationship as does your father or mother. So if you think about differentiation as kind of overlap, right? A lack of differentiation is more overlap, and more differentiation means more separateness while still remaining connected to each other, right? This is fusion, the fusing of two people, and this is healthy attachment, differentiation, right? Two people moving independently, still seeing and hearing each other, but moving independently. Your moods, your feelings, your opinions don't drive me. You being sad isn't evidence to me that I've done something wrong. You being happy isn't evidence that I've done something right. You being sad is about you. You being happy is about you. This is the fundamental stuff that relationships are made of. And so whatever level of differentiation we were kind of cooked in, you know, the soup that we were cooked in, is what we become attracted to later. If you can think of differentiation on a scale from 0 to 100, 100 being perfectly differentiated and 0 being absolutely undifferentiated. If we grew up in a family where we were about a 55, we're only going to want to hang around people that are 50 or 60. 55s don't like 75. 75s don't have anything in common with 55. That's what it means when we talk about taking this programming, this template, this pattern from our family of origin and recreating it in our lives. And the fundamental language, right, idea, concepts around this are the separation of feelings. And my feelings are my responsibility, yours are yours. And if we have a healthy connection, we will see and hear each other without making it about us. So that's where it comes from originally, that differentiation. Examples. I'm responsible for my child's choices. I do this work, and I've been doing it for a long time. And while I teach and preach this all the time, it's hard not to live in that, especially as a parent educator, right? I'm self-conscious around other people with my children when they know my position, because I'm thinking, oh, they're going to judge me, right? They're going to judge me based on something my child does or doesn't do. I'm responsible for my child's feelings is a more central or core kind of way of thinking about this. Like the mother who said to me after getting a letter back from her child, she said, I must have written a horrible letter. And I said, what makes you think that? I thought your letter was great. And she said, well, listen to how upset my son sounds this week in his response. And I said, your child being upset at you is not a measure of how well you did. Something to listen to be curious about, to pay some attention to, absolutely, to ask questions about, but it is not to be interpreted and digested simply as you did something wrong. What did I do wrong? You know, a lot of parents ask this question when their children get to the point that they need a program like ours, like evoked therapy programs. And again, the problem with that thinking is it reduces the child's struggle to being simply about the parent. I think the question of what did I do wrong is a fantastic question to ask oneself all the time. Right? It's why I go to therapy. But to reduce it to a simple cause and effect, that becomes a problem. I hear parents say things like, I have 3 children, 2 of which are doing fine, so I must be doing something right. Right? This idea, again, of simple reduction to cause and effect. Congratulations on your child getting into college or achieving X. Right? I have that in my life sometimes when my children do something well. You have that in your life, I'm sure, with some of your children. It's the same kind of, it's the other side of the coin that leads to the shame that when somebody says, how's your child doing, or mine just got into college, and your child is at Evoke or another program where you don't want to answer the question, you don't know how to answer the question, you don't know how they're going to respond. You know, that question that I get asked all the time, especially by parents considering placement, is, will my child forgive me? And the answer is, your child will forgive you when they grow up. Right? Your child will forgive you when they get healthy, when they do their work. Let's just assume, just for the sake of discussion, let's assume that sending your child to Evoke is a mistake, was a mistake. Let's just assume that for the sake of discussion. It still is your child's job to forgive you, right? I work with children on moving through forgiveness when their parent has been overtly, acutely abusive to them. But making the child kind of responsible for your sense of self, or your self-worth. Fearing their rejection, right? Putting that in their hands, making them responsible for that. Turns them into not a human, but a mirror, where you're just simply looking at them to see a reflection of yourself and how well you're doing or how good you are. Or examples, if my child is happy, I am happy. That idea that we're only as happy as our least happy child. It's an adage that I think in our culture rarely gets questioned. I have mothers and fathers saying to me, you don't understand. And I want to be clear. I have 4 children whom I love dearly, whom I love as much as I'm capable of loving. I love my 4 children. But if I make them responsible for my happiness, my well-being, my sense of serenity. If I shoulder them with that burden, they can't handle it. It's overwhelming. It does very little to nothing to contribute to healthy child development, and does the exact opposite. What did I do to make them upset? I made them upset. You know, that idea that it's simple language makes me feel, makes them kind of language that suggests this cause and effect. Absolutely, you have feelings, and absolutely they're valid, but it's the making you part of it that doesn't make sense. Not when we think about evolved or enlightened relationships. You make me happy, you make me mad, you make me worried, things like that. What can I do to make you happy? All the same kind of things. If you do X, I'll be happy or angry or sad, so stop doing it so I will feel Y, right? Stop doing drugs because I'm worried. Stop cutting on yourself because I'm scared, right? I'll tell you how scared I am when you're doing some of those unhealthy or self-sabotaging things with the idea that now you're supposed to do something about that so I don't feel sad or scared. I hear parents say things like, my parents did it this way or did it a certain way, and I turned out fine. And that doesn't quite make sense, right? Because if your parents did it right, quote unquote right, then they raised a parent who's perfect, right? If it's cause and effect. And so it can't be your fault. I have so many parents over the years that will absolutely easily blame themselves for their child's struggle, but will not blame their parents for their struggle. They would take 100% responsibility for themselves, but not give that same kind of thinking, kind of process to the children. When if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, right? If your children can blame you for turning out horribly, if that's what the case is, then you've got to kind of blame your parents, right? Kind of pass it up the chain. And the fact of the matter is, my experience shows me that I think we're blind to some of our parents' weaknesses, deficits, right? There is in many of us an unspoken, unrealized, even consciously, obligation that we need to take care of our parents and feel a certain way toward them because they needed to feel that way. And then lastly, with regard to this particular dynamic about the parents, the grandparents, the children, this last idea is if your parents did everything so right so that you turned out okay, then you wouldn't be having some of the self-doubt, some of the confusion, right? You'd just be a healthy self. And really, what really happened for most of them is they made you feel responsible for their stuff, their feelings, their sense of pride, happiness, like I've been describing. And then when you had children, you didn't change the way you are. You brought to that what you are. And that's why you feel guilty for how your children turned out, because you as a human being are responsible for what other people think, feel, and do. Your parents taught you that. And you're just changing the characters in the play, in the performance. When people tell me how wonderful their parents are, I always take a breath and become a little concerned, right? Because no parent is perfect. And becoming a healthy self requires us, it really does require us to look at our childhood, the unique history of our childhood, as Alice Miller calls it. It requires us to look at it, to understand the pain, the deficits, the hurt, the messages, the misses, the dents. It really does. And especially when I have somebody tell me over and over again how wonderful their parents are, that's when I become concerned that they've been enlisted in this family message idea that parents have to be good. And to be good, they have to be thought to be good by everybody, especially the children. How did this come up kind of in our communication with our children? This idea of getting out of the cause and effect thinking area. We learn to respond to what our children feel, not with solutions, explanations, or defenses, When we do this, we're implicitly suggesting that the feelings are our responsibility or about us, right? When we explain ourselves, when somebody says to you, Mom and Dad, I'm frustrated that you're making me go to Aftercare, after evoke, just to use a generic example. And when you do anything other than just listen, you're implying that it's your problem to solve, that you need to make it right, make it okay. The best way, what it looks like when somebody just hears you, is they just hear you. I'm glad you're telling me. That makes sense to me. I would feel the same way. I get it. Thanks for saying something. I like this better than the way we used to talk. And I'm going to try to do a better job of listening. You try to wipe your mind clean, ideally, and hear what the other person is saying as if you have no other information. I used to say it this way, that when my wife was sharing some upset feeling about me, I would pretend that she was talking about some other idiot husband. And while I was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek about that, it is sort of a practice, right? Because then I can just hear you. But most of us are preparing for an explanation, kind of our defense. That's not connecting. Reacting is not connecting. And I think most of us, we even feel, I've heard people say this in my personal life as well as professional, that that lack of reaction is a sign to them of disconnection. And in a way, that's because that's the only way that we know that love exists, right? That's the family we grew up in, where people were reactive and argumentative and people had to be right. And they got their buttons pushed and triggers flipped versus just hearing, seeing, understanding. Learn to pause, right? I always say there needs to be a pause before you respond with anything other than listening. Sometimes it's 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days, 5 years. There needs to be a time in there. And the relationship and the specifics will dictate how much time is needed before the person feels like they've been heard and seen. I'll talk a lot more about that on Wednesday when I do the I feel statement more in depth. Ask them for what they want. What would you like from me? And be reluctant to give them what they're asking for, especially if they say, I want to hear your side of it or your explanation. Many times, I was going to say most often, not sure of the stat, but in my experience watching couples and families over years, decades, that's really just an invitation into a dialogue, a debate, an argument about who's right and who's wrong. I try often to say, when somebody's asking to hear my side, to say something like, I don't think it really matters what I'm going to say, what my thinking, that's not important. I just want to hear you and understand where you're coming from and be there for that. Ask for what they want, and then you can also ask permission to respond. Would you like to hear what I'm thinking? Or to just move on to something else. Like, have I heard that? Are you ready to move on? Or do we need to do anything more with this? Do you need more closure? Or do we need to clean something up here? And when you ask for the permission, if you start to step into it and they start to argue with you, then you know they weren't ready for it. They weren't ready to hear your side of it, your thoughts on it. So much of this is related to guilt, which again, it's one of my missions in life, to teach people how guilt is not associated with mental health, clarity, authenticity, enlightenment. And the idea is out there that it is. Brene Brown's several million, I don't know how many millions of hits or watches she has on her first famous YouTube video. She says out loud, shame is associated with mental illness and addiction, and guilt is associated with mental health. She says that. It's not true. Not at all. It's more subtle, perhaps, and less dramatic, but it's a similar beast. So we work on letting go of guilt. We work on letting go of guilt so that we can be more loving, compassionate, honest, authentic, present, differentiated people. Guilt is a little trigger that I've done something to hurt you. Well, everybody here on this webinar can think of something that's the right thing to do in a relationship in their lives where they might hurt somebody's feeling. A boundary, to say no. Right? It's very easy to think of dozens, hundreds, thousands of examples where you would be doing the right thing and somebody might feel hurt, disappointed, sad, scared even, all kinds of feelings. I used to give the example that my mother wants me to join her faith, her religion. And she worries about me in the same way you would describe worrying about a child doing drugs. Like she's worried that I'm not going to be okay, that I might not make it to heaven, right? She prays for me. She has her church pray for me, and I'm not going to do it even though it upsets her. But I wouldn't do that. Wouldn't want my children to do that for me, to give up an important part of themselves so that I was happy. So we got to find our truth, our center, our intention. That's that work of differentiation of self. Understand the need to feel guilt and do the right thing anyway. That a lot of times we're going to need to learn to tolerate our guilt. Self-care often has us do battle with our guilt. Showing up assertively and honestly has us do battle with our guilt. Setting boundaries has us do battle with our guilt. Guilt will persist for some time after you decide to do the right things in life. You have to have been programmed to be responsible, to feel responsible for other people's feelings. That's where it comes from. Learning to take back the responsibility, in AlAnon they say, for our own serenity. I add to that list our own self-esteem, our own happiness, our anxiety, our feelings. Even if your kid is making a great case for you being an anxious parent, right? They're doing things that every parent would feel. It still becomes your job to manage that, not theirs. That's not what recovery and healing is about for a child, is changing what you're doing, how you're living so that your parents feel better. This work allows you more clearly, accurately to see your child and her needs, to hear them. It often requires dealing with some of the baggage, the ways of thinking from childhood. I talk about the idea of enlightened parenting. Enlightened parenting is full of love for self and others. It's forgiving of self, forgiving of others. It's not laced with guilt, or the person learns to do battle to tolerate it, to do that heroic work. It's painful, absolutely, at times. It seeks to find the self, both in yourself, to find yourself in yourself and in the other person. Right? That's the idea of parenting, the shift from producing outcomes. Right? We talked about that when we talked about Madeline Levine's book, The Price of Privilege. Right? We talked about when I talked about the suicide epidemic in our culture with young people. Right? We're not raising outcomes, successful children that are accomplishing things. We're trying to raise healthy selves, which is messy and hard. And it's not always going to be reinforced by the culture. It's not going to be reinforced by our own childhood and teachings. I love this little cartoon I have in the book, where from Savage Chickens by Doug Savage, where it talks about the 3 stages of self-awareness. In frame number 1, it says one chicken saying to another one, "You're an idiot," and chicken number 2 is saying, "No, I'm not." And in 2, it says, "You're an idiot," and chicken number 2 is saying, "Yes, I am." And then in 3, chicken number 2 is just saying, "I'm an idiot," right? It's this way of just saying, I'm human. I struggle. I make mistakes. I'm not beating myself up over it. This isn't self-deprecating humor. It's just that's the most enlightened place to be. Think about it. The people that our culture and our history books have told us they're enlightened, they will talk about their deficits, their limitations, their humanness more. People that aren't enlightened want to tell you about how great they are all the time. And it's a continuum, but you'll recognize that in some of our culture today also. Lessons from AlAnon and others. The 3 C's in AlAnons are that you didn't cause it in terms of the alcoholism in your family. You can't control it, and you can't cure it. Right? And I want to be very clear, because this can be misunderstood. Remember this. Somebody who is in AlAnon, who has dropped the baggage that they caused it or control it or can cure it, that same person is working their tail off on self-improvement, on becoming more courageous, authentic, aware, honest, assertive. So this letting go of the cause and effect doesn't lead to abdication of responsibilities, right? Laissez-faire, I'm not going to do anything since it's not my fault. Doing it in this way that we're talking about tonight on this broadcast, it leads to the only real road to enlightened relationships with anybody, including our children. Alcoholics are addicted to alcohol, right? They pick up the bottle. Codependents are addicted to people, changing people, fixing people. It's easy to be that way. And some people even think about it as, well, I just love so much. Not in the way that I'm thinking. The way that I'm thinking, love is stepping away from it. Love is letting go. Love is doing your work. I mean, again, I have a bias in this, right? But when I talk about like the work and the workshops and the parent meetings and all the work that I do with parents and share with you all, doing the work, going to doing your own therapy, I think that's the greatest expression of love that you can give to your child. Multiple benefits, many times over, more beneficial than thinking, how can I fix my child? One of the slogans in AlAnon is, take me out of the blame and all you get is blah, blah, blah. Einstein said, listen not to criticisms or accolades, both take you off your path. In the Four Agreements, they talk about one of the agreements being basically, what you think about me is none of my business. Right? It's not about me. Accept that you did the best you could with what you had at the time, but it no longer needs to be that way, and to forgive yourself. Right? It's holding on that dialectic that I share in my book that was shared with me, which is you're at all times doing the best you can, and at all times you can do better. When we learn to embrace kind of that middle path, that duality, we live in this healthier, more enlightened way. You cannot control the wind. You cannot control others. You can't stop your husband from drinking, your wife from drinking, your child from cutting. You can't do that. You can't control the wind, but you can set your sails. You can set how you respond to it in the work that you do. So what are the take-home messages? Listen. Listening is a great sign that you're doing this work. Really deeply listen. Narcissists can't listen. Narcissistically wounded people who haven't done their work can't listen. Reprogram. It's a new way to live, but keep trying. Anything I say sounds hopeful or different, look at it. Consider doing your own work. Come to our intensives. Go to somebody else's intensive. Get your own therapist. Right? Make yourself the project. Practice skills, because the skills can sometimes lead you to the change. Right? It's like the George Orwell quote. When I was in 10th grade, before I dropped out of high school, which I did do, there was a quote up on the board in English class that said, if thought corrupts language, then language can corrupt thought. Meaning that we know that thinking affects what we say, but what we say can also affect what we think, for positive or negative. So changing some of the verbiage. I'll talk more about that on Wednesday, can make a change in you. Letting go of outcomes and turning it back over to the child, perhaps to a higher power, if that helps you. Instead of course, pretending to be a higher power. One of my friends who's in recovery says, the biggest difference between me and God is God never thinks he's me. So it's letting go of that idea that I have to do everything, get everything right, because maybe I grew up in a home where I had to be hyper vigilant like that for it to be okay. But I can do work to leave that where it needs to be left, which is in my past. Creating a new differentiated self allows for intimacy and connection, right? I want to be as clear as I can with this because I've said this in previous broadcasts, it's in my book, that people ask all the time, but what about connection? What about connection? You're always talking about healthy detachment. A healthy self is the first ingredient, in fact, the first necessary ingredient in a relationship. If a self is underdeveloped, intimacy by definition is impossible, because intimacy has to consist of two separate selves. So that's the work, that's the starting point. To me, the work of self is the work of intimacy. But again, in our culture, we think that we can do self through relationships, right? We spend time with other people. We get married early. We go from relationship to relationship. We do all of that instead of working on ourselves. And then decide who and how you'll be in a relationship without being held hostage by it, led by it, determined by it, if you will. All right, happy to take any questions that have come in on topic, and then I'll go through some upcoming events, announcements, education, and then I can take any other questions toward the end. So looks like none have come in. Let me go over some announcements, then I'll take some at the end again. You can write them to Alex and pass them along if you want. Follow us on social media. These broadcasts are all available on the podcast app on your iPhone. So go to the podcast app on your iOS device. On Android devices, go to your app store and download the SoundCloud app. On a computer, you can go to soundcloud.com. On all platforms, simply search Evoke Therapy Programs and subscribe there, and then they'll just come up. You can listen to them on the train while you drive. Twitter and Instagram, follow us at Evoke Therapy. Facebook, search Evoke Therapy Programs. The Family Foundation, a foundation founded by alumni families to help people that can't afford therapy or treatment. Feel free to go there, become involved there on Facebook. The Evoke Therapy blog is new content all the time, so check in with our blog. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Amazon. Right now, the main warehouse is out, but you can go to the new options under the paperback button on your Amazon page and buy them from Evoke Therapy Programs directly. If you would like to do an intensive, we still have a spot left. I strongly encourage you to attend one of our Finding You intensives. The next one is June 6th. There's still a spot left if you can make it. June 6th through 10th. Following that will be July 18th through 22nd. We're going to be doing a Finding You 2 that is filling up. That'll be October 10th through 14th, and then coming soon will be an alumni intensive, former students that have gone through our program, designing an intensive that's just for them if they want to come back and be reconnected. You can tell them that this is going to be indoors in our Summit Lodge. And then private family intensives are available by contacting us, our website or our admissions crew. If you are a professional in the mental health field, mental health or addiction field, you're also welcome to go to our professional workshops. The next women's workshop with an opening is September 9th to 11th. We still have one opening in the men's workshop, June 10th through 12th. The next parent support group, I'll have a list of these next week. We're going to be setting up some all around the country. I'm going on sabbatical, June 18th to August 3rd. And so this is the last one that I'll be doing for the summer. And then some of our therapists are going to be spreading out all over the country, so you'll get to meet some of those. New York, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, the Northwest, Chicago. We'll also take requests also. If you possibly can, we want all families to come out to a workshop. Our next workshop is June 23rd through 24th. It's a 2-day workshop, multifamily, experiential, psychoeducation. You can combine that, the timing of that, with a visit to your child if your Evoke therapist says that it's the right time. Pursuits trips are adventure trips for young adults and families. Think of Sober Fun or Therapy Light. Happy to take any live questions that come up. My father held me 100% responsible for his feelings and hates my boundaries. I'm 53 and have done much grieving work and acceptance of him. I've chosen not to have contact with him. I question myself about that and wonder, should I get past this? First of all, make sure when you post the questions, Alex, that you don't put the person's name in there so that it can be anonymous. I'm 53 and have done much work and acceptance of him. I've chosen not to have contact with him. I question myself a lot about that and wonder if I should get past this. You know, sometimes not talking to a father is the right thing to do. You know, there are relationships in my life that I have moved on from. And I've even had people in my life say, well, you're a therapist. And what they don't understand is sometimes self-care is no. Sometimes no is a full sentence. Sometimes no is, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I can tell you that I have set very similar boundaries with many people in my life, my family of origin. And some people have responded and rallied around those boundaries that I set, which I think are healthy boundaries, and come back and said, I can love you and support you in what you're doing. And some people have said, I don't know what you're talking about. And if the behavior is still unacceptable, I have this idea that we earn the time right? People earn the time that my time by the way that they treat me, right? I don't believe in, I don't think it's necessarily healthy or enlightened that I owe an obligation to hang around somebody, even my father or mother, if they have been abusive and continue to be abusive and not respect my boundaries. It's okay to set that boundary. So I wouldn't tell you not to, I wouldn't tell you to do it. I can tell you that sometimes it's a very, very healthy thing to do. And I don't have the idea that any of us have. I wouldn't want my children to, I would not want my children to allow me in their life if what I was doing was hurting them, was causing a wound, was not respecting them and who they are. I would never want them to just have me in their life out of obligation because I wanted it. So that's my thought. Where do we find more details about the intensives? You can go to our website. There's a frequently asked question about it. Chapter 1 of my book talks about mine that I went to that we patterned ours after, but the website under other programs and intensives. You can also call me or admissions if you're interested in learning more by email intensives@evoketherapy.com. And the location for the intensives is in Park City, Utah, at a cabin. It's about 25 minutes from the Salt Lake City airport, so it's an easy ride from the airport. We actually pick you up and drop you off at the airport. It's all inclusive. All the food, all the lodging is there. And then we do psychodrama, mindfulness, group therapy, art therapy, family of origin work for 4 days. It's fantastic. I go to one every year for myself. Next question. So you say if our child says, I'm upset about having to go to aftercare, you say to just sit with this thought and say, I understand. Isn't the child looking for an answer, not just looking to be heard? Oh, yeah. They want you to answer so that you can argue. If they want an explanation, then what it would sound like is you would say, I'll tell you two things about that. Is they would say, I'm really upset about going to aftercare, for example. And if you said, well, we've kind of come to the conclusion after consulting with other people that it's the best way to maintain the gains that we've started here. And that people find it to be a more effective kind of course of treatment. And then if your child was to respond and say, you know, thanks for telling me, that makes a lot of sense, which they never, ever, ever, ever say. They say, well, but why can't I just come home? And then, right, they rebut and they argue. So they're not really looking, the answer is no, they're not really looking for information. They're looking for a debate. And I don't mean that in a disrespectful, flippant way. It's just kind of human nature. I've shared this example many times, haven't shared it lately, but the idea is that I've shared that I've said to clients, let's say that they want to have a phone call with their parent. And I've said to clients, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a pound of M&Ms, right? That's the reward system out there. If they do something special, they get one or two in a couple of months period. One usually is the most that they'd ever get. But I did this experiment a couple of times. Think about a pound of M&Ms being the equivalent of about $10,000 in currency for you. I've said to them, I'll give you a pound of M&Ms if you can tell me why I wouldn't let you call your mom, or why I wouldn't let you come home, or why your parents wouldn't let you come home, or why I'm recommending that you not go home after this. Before I can finish the sentence, the child has given me a perfect essay, outline of why it would be not helpful to call their parents or why it would be recommended that they go to aftercare. They know why. They're not looking for data. They think they are, but they're really looking for a debate. So you can try giving the answer, but if they come back and rebuttal, you know they're not looking for the answer. Really what they're saying is, I don't like this. I don't like what you're saying and doing. I'm upset about it. I don't want it. Another says, the message of AlAnon is tricky as a parent to a child because while you want the child to begin to own and think independently, you also want to encourage and support. This is hard to do and it feels like I'm stepping down as a parent. I cannot tell you how glad I am that you wrote that. I cannot tell you that. And I will tell you this as honestly and sincerely and empathically as I can. It is hard work. That I absolutely know and agree with and struggle with it myself. It is different, and you can do it with little children. I have children right now, as of May 28th, 2018, that are ages 10, 16, 23, and 25. And I see the principles with my youngest. I remember thinking about the AlAnon principles when my children were 2 and 3 and 4. It's subtle, but it's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. The simple example, I remember coming home after a business trip with one of my young children. And my young child was upset that I'd been gone, like a child might feel. And so she said to me, she ran in the laundry room, she ran away from me. And the babysitter who was there said, "Don't run away from your father, come and give him a hug." And I said, "No, that's not how we do it in our family. She's allowed to feel this. I can see her. She wasn't being disrespectful, she was being hurt." I remember when my son was 5, and he said to me, he said, "Captain Hook," when we were watching Disney's Peter Pan, "Captain Hook isn't mad, Dad, he's just sad, isn't he?" Right? He was starting to learn about emotional awareness. My little daughter says to me, our Rottweiler who passed away a couple of years ago, lovely, lovely, lovely dog, loved him. His name was Coda. And she would say, "Can't Coda get on the couch?" And I would say, "I know it's horrible, isn't it, that he can't get on the couch?" And then she would say, "Oh, so he can?" And I'd say, "No, but it makes sense. It's a bummer." Right? So I will tell you, it's of course it's different. Of course the decisions are different. It's different than a spouse, but it's more similar than you think. And being an AlAnoner, right, recovering from codependency, it really does show up in dozens and dozens of ways in every relationship. So I empathize with you. One parent says, "Thank you so much. It's all about self-care for me." I think so. Another parent says, "We're planning on a field visit June 6th in Bend. I'd love to go to the Finding You. Could I come a day late?" Unfortunately, you can't. I wish you could. It's kind of, everybody has to arrive. It's kind of a group process. So maybe another one. All right. I think that's all for this evening. Last question. To the end. The next one will be on, you're very welcome. The next one will be on the I feel statement and effective communication, kind of building off of this. I'll go more in depth to it. It's Wednesday, May 30th. This Wednesday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Have a great couple of days. Thank you for and on behalf of your children for the work that you do to show up to these, to try, to be open, to learn. It's in my opinion, that's what love is. It's that willingness, courage to expand yourself. Take care, folks. I'll talk to you in 2 days. Bye-bye.